Episode 9 Airadin's Wrath. Linrem sat in his study, staring idly up at the web of tracking suspended in the air all around him, and absent-mindedly swirling his 3 juggling balls in his hand, though none of the balls were touching his skin. His eyes slid from one item to the next, following the complex weave of will strings that he had spent so many years putting together. His thoughts were miles away in the little pine grove that Rabineau and Eris were currently perusing. Linrem could only just feel them on the edge of his awareness. Distant lights, their souls shining like a lighthouse on a stormy sea. He smiled wanly as he thought of his apprentice and of the wily cat that had become Eris the Eternal. Perhaps his only true friends. Which is why he had to send them away. Father, a tall man had just strolled casually into the middle of the study, his deep voice dripping with menace. My, oh my, how you have grown old. Linrem closed his eyes, shedding several tears before fixing his gaze upon the newcomer. The balls had vanished. I was wondering when you were going to show up, Airadin. Ignoring this remark, Airadin looked around at the web of tracking, a smirk pulling at the corner of his lips. You have been busy, haven't you? Apparently not well enough, Linrem snapped. This damn thing was supposed to warn me when you drew near. It's a good thing I sensed your presence yesterday, drawing ever closer. Airadin tutted, shaking his head with a self-satisfied smile. Oh, Father, did you really think such a technique would work on me? It did work, Linrem frowned. For many years it worked. Only because I allowed it to, Airadin sneered. Geriatric fool. I felt your working forming before you ever cast the first string. It worked because I fed you the information I wanted you to have. The color had begun draining from Linrem's face. That's not possible. At such a distance, even I cannot sense another's workings, however powerful. Even when released, the reverberations don't echo across such vast expanses. Ah, Linrem said with a malicious grin, raising 2 fingers. But you forget 2 things. I am your son, and he drew a gleaming black longsword from midair. I have Raquel. Linrem's eyes filled with sorrow as he saw the blade he had spent a century forging. Even with Raquel, the distance is too great. Ugh, Airadin scoffed in irritation. You're clearly not listening. Perhaps, Lin shot back. Why don't you get to the point, then? Fine, Airadin replied, his malicious grin returning. When I claimed the sword from you, I was able to use the signature of your will, which was so liberally imbued. All I had to do was pull off a piece and follow the pattern, weaving my own tracker. Only instead of taking up an entire study in the vain efforts to keep tabs on you, I seated mine in your very soul, wrapped up tight in your very own energy, so you never even noticed it was there. I've been able to sense your every working long before you cast it, ever since. Lin grew paler still. You lie! There's no possible way I wouldn't have noticed such a thing. Oh? Airadin said quietly. Why don't we find out? In one swift motion, Airadin easily sank the tip of Raquel into the floor, freeing both of his hands to fly up before him, palms facing Lin and fingers splayed. Before Linrem could react, Airadin pushed his hands several inches forward, and he felt the man's magical grip on him, strong as steel. Airadin spread his hands slowly apart while he narrowed his eyes, looking all over Linrem as if he were searching for something. Then, seeming to find what it was he was looking for, Airadin's right hand snapped triumphantly closed, as if he had caught something. He pulled it forward, towards himself, and Linrem felt as if part of his stomach was being rearranged and then pulled out of him. Airadin finished. He held out his hand to Linrem, palm upwards, and a glowing mass came to float before him. Lin was on the brink of losing consciousness, but as his eyes swam into focus, he saw that the source of the strange light was a swirling collection of words. As he stared at it, he could finally sense the words that were built using his own will. He understood immediately that the words he saw were the very words Airadin spoke to create whatever this thing was. In between the swirling lines of words, Linrem saw something else, a darker source of light. Whereas the words weaved with his own will were sky blue, the most common color his will took when manifesting, the glimpses he caught of what lay beneath was a dark, midnight blue. "Can you see it, Father?" Airadin cooed patronizingly. "Let me help you." With his other hand, he reached into his open palm, seeming to grab onto something small and fluttering. He then pulled, slowly but purposefully. As he did so, the ball of light changed. The sky-blue lines of words were being pulled away, unwrapping what lay hidden beneath. When Airadin finished, his tracker sat in the air before Linrem's face, gleaming darkly, an intensely dense knot of slowly moving words woven from the same dark blue will, Airadin's will. The more he looked at it, the more Linrem knew Airadin's words to be true. With that realization came another. "You're going to kill me," he said softly. "Aren't you?" Airadin cocked his head to the side. "Oh, that depends entirely on you, old man." Linrem chuckled. "Don't lie to me, son." "You know why I'm here, Father," Airadin said coldly. "Where is it?" "I do not know what you mean, Airadin." "Yes, you do." Airadin swept his hands before him as if clearing away smoke, causing the tracker ball to explode into motes of light and disappear. He then grabbed at the binds holding Linrem and pulled, causing Lin to shoot across the room to stop directly before him. Airadin looked straight into Linrem's eyes. "Your book of will. Where is it?" Linrem smiled mischievously. "If it's a good read you're after, I've got some wonderful novels written by—" "Do not toy with me!" Airadin roared, his face contorted with rage. As quick as a blink, Airadin backhanded Linrem across the face. Lin felt blood begin to trickle down the side of his mouth. "Where is it, you impossible old fool?" "I thought I taught you better than to covet what wasn't yours," Linrem said with a twinkle in his eye. Airadin slammed his fist into Linrem's stomach, forcing the air from his lungs with a whoosh. "It's over, Father. Can't you see that?" Airadin stepped so close Lin could feel the breath from his words as he looked into his eyes and saw the fathomless pit of hatred contained within. "For once in your miserable life, get out of my way." Linrem chuckled sadly. "I believe you misunderstand what it is to be a father, Airadin. I tried to guide you down the right path, and if I can no longer do that," his eyes flashed dangerously, "then I will stand in your way. I will do whatever I can to save the world from you." Lin hadn't even seen him move. However, the black leather hilt of Raquel was back in Airadin's hands, and the blade was now sliding slowly into his belly. The pain hit Lynn like a wall of fire, burning and searing his insides and releasing a guttural scream that tore at the walls of his throat. Airadin slowly pulled the blade out, and Lynn felt blood, hot and wet, begin to stream from the wound. "Don't get the wrong idea, father," Airadin said softly, his face contorted in a sick visage of glee and malice. "I did not come here to commiserate. Far from it. I came to take what is mine and to end your miserable life. That wound is far from fatal." Airadin dug a finger into the raw, bloody wound, and Linrem screamed again. "Now, I'll ask you again. Where is the book?" Lynn's head lolled forward and his eyes slid closed. He didn't move. Then he began to laugh. Softly at first, and then so uproariously that tears streamed from his eyes. "You dare mock me?" Airadin grabbed Lynn by the throat, bringing up his head and looking him in the face. "Make no mistake, Linrem. I do not need you to find it. Do not overestimate your own usefulness." "Do not," Lynn wheezed around Airadin's hand, "underestimate your father." Airadin scowled and looked down. Linrem's right arm had been caught folded against his chest, but his left was held to his side, fist balled tight. As soon as Airadin noticed, Lynn pulled. Two great jaws of sky blue sprang up from the floor on either side of Airadin and snapped shut like the maw of a massive alligator. As soon as the trap closed on Airadin, the bindings holding Linrem vanished, freeing him. In one swift move, Linrem crossed the room and pulled a gleaming dark oak staff from where it had hung on the wall. He spun it expertly and assumed a defensive stance. Seconds later, Raquel sang as it tore through the trap like it was wet paper. The great jaws gave one last shiver and exploded into light, just as the tracker had. Airadin roared like an enraged beast as he burst from the trap. His crazed eyes darted around the room until they settled on Linrem, looking livid. Rage was painted all over his face and clearly coursed throughout his body. He hadn't escaped the trap completely unharmed. The teeth had managed to sink into his left shoulder and his right calf, made apparent by the torn cloth and blood all around the wounds. Airadin sported several more cuts and scrapes, but none as deep as those two. "How did you do that?" he snarled. "Very carefully," Lynn answered, not taking his eyes off of his son. "I never sensed you making a trap like that," Airadin said angrily. "There's no way you could have made such a large working without me knowing." "Your greatest weakness, Airadin, is assuming you have all of the cards in your hand." Linrem swung the staff and a jet of air blasted into Airadin, pushing him several inches before he deflected it. "I am your father, after all." "Answer the question, old man," Airadin snarled. The corner of Lynn's mouth pulled up into a mischievous grin once more. "You seem to be under the impression that you are the only mage with astounding natural talent. Seem to labor under the idea that your natural abilities are unique to you and not inherited." Airadin frowned, but he did not interrupt. Holding Raquel loosely at his side, he appraised his father. You did indeed place your little tracker within the folds of my voluminous soul quite expertly. Wrapping your own working tightly within my very own will was genius. I imagine it would have been successful on any other mage, and I will admit, I had no idea you had done such a thing. At first. How did you find it? Airadin growled. His anger seemed to be pushed down in favor of rapt curiosity. You never took my daily exercises seriously, son, Linrem said gravely. If you had, you would already know the answer to that question. Airadin scoffed. Psh, you act like meditation is the key to all of your problems. Linrem merely smiled sadly and continued. I cannot say that I spotted it immediately. It did indeed take me several months, and had I not begun building this web, it is likely I wouldn't have noticed it for quite a while longer. However, Lin's sorrow turned to resolve. You are arrogant and blinded by your superior abilities, and that makes you predictable. When I realized that my working wasn't quite having the desired effect, though it was conceived and cast perfectly, I began to suspect something was awry. I took a full month, sinking into a deep trance, to comb through every ethereal inch of my soul, and that was when I found it. After examining your handiwork carefully, I determined that I could easily remove the outer layers of protection, seeing as they were created using my own will. You had no connection to that part of the working, not like your own will, which was knotted so tight the slightest touch would alert you, and I had no desire to do that. I had gained the advantage, you see. Without touching your working, I examined it, inferring what I could about the exact nature of the working and how it functioned. From what I could see on the surface, I was able to speculate with 95% accuracy. Of course, there was the distinct possibility that there was more to the working beneath the surface that I simply was not privy to and could not access without touching the working, thus negating the whole ordeal. So, instead of speculating further, I began experimenting, just to see how much information you could draw from the working. Shortly after that, I discovered the most delightful thing. Would you like to know what it was, Airadin? Do not toy with me, father, Airadin said coolly. Continue your story. Linrem frowned. Never any flair for showmanship, Makes for a very boring reveal. Lackluster, even. Here I am going to great lengths to help you understand just how I came to circumvent your little present, and you can't even appreciate the intricacy of it all. Airadin slashed Raquel horizontally in Lin's direction, which sent a wide arc of sparkling dark blue energy shooting at him. Lin lazily waved a hand before himself as if he were shooing a bothersome fly, and the lethal energy blade simply stopped existing. You see, son, Lin continued as if Airadin hadn't just tried to cut him in half, I discovered that your working was so very limited in scope. My castings had to consume a base amount of energy to even trigger a response. Did you know that? What am I saying? Of course you didn't. You see, son, you see. That allowed me to be free from you. Do you understand now? No! Airadin screamed, spittle flying from his mouth and veins pulsing menacingly. I tire of your games, father. Get to the point before I finish you. Linrem smiled. Lack of imagination, he nodded slowly. I do believe that will be your downfall. He looked at his son for a long moment before he continued. Your working had a threshold for energy consumption. Simply put, as long as I worked all of my important castings as small as I could, you would be none the wiser of what I was up to. Airadin looked as if he had been slapped. That is not possible. You cannot shrink workings. The energy consumption wouldn't change, neither would the size of the casting. Linrem's smile grew wider. Lack of imagination. He swung his staff as he had prior, causing Airadin to throw up his hands before him to block the blow. which instead of coming straight at him as a previous had, caught him on the right side, sending him shooting across the room to slam into the wall, hard enough to send fissures and webbed cracks into the masonry behind him. Airadin growled and slammed his fist into the wall, creating craters of his own as he used the kinetic energy to push himself off of the wall. He carried the energy forward, streaking towards Linram with Raquel held high. The gleaming black blade sang through the air and came down, meeting Linram's oak staff with a resounding crack. "So then," Airadin said softly, his face inches from Lynn's as their muscles strained with the effort of their clashing arms. "How were you able to shrink your workings?" "Oh, I didn't shrink them," Lynn said, his grin returning. He straightened, removing one hand from his staff, yet the force arresting Raquel never wavered. The weapons remained clashed. He waved his hand in the air next to the pair, and a sheet of sky blue appeared, hovering in the air like an enchanted piece of paper. His smile widening, Len waved his hand again, and the paper sprouted lines crisscrossing all over its surface. He looked at Airadin. "Do you see it yet, son?" he asked softly, and then waved his hand a third time, and the sheet burst along the intricate web of lines, seeming to shatter into hundreds of pieces. However, unlike the tracker and the trap after it had been sliced by Raquel, the casting didn't simply dissolve into motes of light. The pieces hung suspended, spinning softly but remaining in the air. "Like a jigsaw puzzle," Linram said with glee. "I discovered how to break apart my castings to work them in the smallest of ways, building anything I wish to keep hidden from you, one little piece at a time." "That's impossible," Airadin breathed softly, his eyes wide with surprise. And was that the slightest flash of fear? "Ah," Lynn said, shaking the index finger of his free hand before Airadin's face. "But you have already seen the fruits of my labors. And furthermore," Lynn's free hand formed several symbols in rapt succession. "Now that you have shown your hand and removed the tracker," Lynn slammed his palm into Airadin's chest, ripples of power shimmering down his arm, "I'm free to cast as I please." A concussion like a small bomb detonated against Airadin's chest, and he was hurled across the room once more. This time, when he slammed into the masonry, the stone and mortar gave way, and the mage went sailing out of the tower. "Not so fast," Lynn breathed, grabbing at the air and seizing handfuls like it was a great rope. He then pulled hard. With resounding crack, Airadin came shooting back through the hole in the wall, flying straight towards Linram. The wizened old man caught Airadin one-handed and slammed him into the ground. Lynn spun his staff and brought the end down inches from Airadin's face. Linram smiled, but before he could say any more, white-hot pain lanced through his back and straight through his stomach. Looking down in shock, he saw the end of Raquel, black blade shining with his blood, protruding several inches from his gut. "Well played, father," Airadin said softly into his ear from behind him. The Airadin on the ground writhed and burst into smoke. "There was a moment there when I was genuinely surprised. Oh, how very long it has been since I have felt that." Airadin twisted the blade and pulled it out with a vicious yank. Linram coughed and spat a large amount of blood onto the floor, falling to his knees as he did so. Airadin walked around Lynn triumphantly, stopping before him and drinking in the stunned expression on his face. Kneeling down, Airadin looked Linram in the eyes. Raquel pointed at his chest. "Now that wound," Airadin said, nodding to the profusely bleeding hole in Lynn's torso, "is fatal." Linrem tried to laugh, but ended up coughing instead, head drooping to his chest. When he brought his gaze back up to Airadin's, he smiled. "Finish it," he said weakly. Airadin said. "This is your last chance, father. Now tell me, where is the book?" Lynn spat a mouthful of blood at Airadin's face, spraying him with gore and making him look even more demented. White teeth sparkled among the red as Airadin smiled, bringing up his free hand and snapping his fingers. Instantly, all the blood had vanished, as if it had never been spat at all. "Have it your way, then." As quick as a blink, Airadin struck. Raquel slammed into Linrem's chest, driving into the hilt so hard Lin's rib cage splintered and cracked. But the blade had pierced his heart. With Airadin so close to him, Lin grabbed his elbow with a grip surprisingly strong for a dying man. His wide, pain-filled eyes found Airadin's, and as a tear rolled down his cheek, he opened his mouth and uttered, "I love you, son." Linrem died. Silence filled the room, only broken by the soft patter of blood dripping to the floor. Airadin stared into the face of his father for a long moment, brow furrowed. Psst! He rose slowly to his feet. "Impossible, old man." He put a foot on Lin's shoulder and pulled Raquel free. Linrem's body slumped to the floor in a growing pool of blood. Airadin stared down at Lin's body for several moments longer, looking perplexed. Then his frown deepened, and he sliced Raquel through the air savagely, dislodging all of the blood and gore on the blade and leaving it spotless. He then slid it carefully into the air before him, as if sheathing the blade, and as he did so, it vanished. Hands now free, Airadin turned slowly, studying the room around him. After he had rotated in place several times, he reached into his coat pocket and brought out a handful of small pebbles. He stared at the pebbles unblinkingly, and then they were not pebbles at all, but a handful of writhing spiders. He brought the hand close to his face and whispered, "Find the secrets." The spiders bounded off of his hand, scuttling off in every direction. As he watched the spiders scurrying off to do his biddings, things began to fall all around him. Airadin looked over sharply as a piece of parchment floated down right next to him. Looking up, Airadin saw that the massive web of tracking Linrem had built was fading with the death of the man. The strings were slowly sliding out of existence, and the items were being released to fall down to the office floor. As Airadin watched, the massive strings gave one last shiver and vanished. The rest of the items stuck in the web came clattering down. Airadin appraised the items that had fallen, eyes settling on one in particular. One of the spiders gave a whistle, announcing it had found something. Before he went to see what the spider had discovered, he knelt down and picked up a small stuffed bear, holding it for a moment before tucking it into his coat. Getting to his feet, Airadin crossed the room to where several of the spiders were now excitedly pacing around a blank section of wall. He snapped his fingers and the spiders immediately transformed back into pebbles, shooting straight back into his pocket. Airadin stood, staring at the wall for several long moments, sensing for what could not be seen. After he appraised a while longer, He finally raised a hand before him and said, "Open," his deep voice resonating with command. The section of wall trembled as it slowly slid backwards before splitting in half vertically, and the two halves sliding soundlessly into the walls on either side. Airadin now stared down a dark hallway, the dark clinging so thickly his gaze could barely pierce beyond the threshold. Airadin frowned, which deepened into a scowl. "Predictable," he scoffed. He raised his hand before him once more. A shining mirror image of himself had appeared before the threshold. Airadin nodded towards the hallway, and the blazing apparition nodded in acknowledgement, turning and slowly stepping over the threshold. As soon as the working crossed into the hallway, traps began firing off. Spears shot out of the walls, skewering the shimmering doppelganger, but doing no damage. Poison darts shot at them from further down the hallway, making Airadin raise an irritated hand to stop them from hitting him. With the casting's next step, blue fire shot from the floor, roaring angrily. None of these traps affected Airadin's casting, and none could get close to Airadin himself. Finally, the apparition reached the end of the hallway, which was surprisingly short given the depth of the darkness held within, and was now standing before a door so dark it blended into the dark stones all around the frame. The casting reached for the knob just as Airadin sensed it. "No!" he bellowed, but it was too late. As soon as the working touched the knob, a wall of sky blue energy blasted down the hallway. Airadin swore and dove out of the way to avoid the blast. Getting back to his feet, he peered cautiously down the hallway and saw that though his working had been blasted to dust, the darkness that had clung so heavily to the space seemed to have been blown away as well. He studied the space and the few short feet between himself and the door. Closing his eyes, Airadin felt for any signs of lingering magic. However, the pulsing answer that came from just beyond the door, the prize he had committed patricide for, was enough to overpower any other working in the room beyond. There would likely be traps triggered as soon as the door was opened, and the door could clearly not be opened with will magic workings. It had to be opened by hand. Airadin smirked, closing the short distance to the door and grasping the handle confidently. He turned the handle and threw the door open. Nothing happened. A small podium stood just inside the tiny room beyond. A large, thickly bound leather book stood upon it. The book itself was unimpressive visually, but Airadin could feel the power radiating off of it. He had found Linrem's Book of Will, the very tome he had used to record his workings and experimentations for centuries, long ago becoming a deeply magical artifact itself. Airadin smiled victoriously. Before he stepped into the room, he sensed for any other traps remaining, but could find none. Satisfied, he stepped across the threshold. He stared at the book for several long moments, almost reverent of the prize he had come to collect. Reaching out slowly with both hands, Airadin grasped the book. The second it lifted off of the podium, several things happened all at once. Airadin was gripped strongly by invisible bonds, yanking his legs and arms out and lifting him several inches into the air, spread eagle. The Book of Will rose into the air of its own accord and began vibrating, shining brightly with Linrem's sky blue energy. Lastly, an apparition of Linrem himself appeared on the other side of the podium. It was not like Airadin's working, for this one was simply a pre-recorded message for Airadin himself. "Oh, son," Linrem smiled sadly and shook his head. I told you I would always be standing in your way. You fool. The Book of Will vanished with a small pop. No! Airadin screamed, straining against the bonds holding him. He reached out for Raquel, but before he could grasp the pommel, sky blue spikes shot from every surface, piercing Airadin like a pincushion. The man coughed and a spray of blood issued from his mouth. Linrim's apparition was fading, still shaking his head softly. You fool. It, too, vanished. Finally, the spikes in the bonds holding Airadin vanished, dropping the man. Airadin was unable to even break his fall, tumbling limply to the ground. Trembling violently, he reached out once more and finally grasped the pommel of Raquel. With a gasp, he carefully used the depleted remains of his well to heal his vital organs and stem imminent death. He dare not try any more. He seized and coughed up a great deal of blood, writhing on the ground. At last, he seemed to catch a ragged breath, parting his bloody lips to call, Archimedes! A figure shrouded entirely in black appeared in the middle of the office. The figure took in the destruction and Linrim's still form on the ground before finally seeing the hidden passage and Airadin laying in the room beyond. They moved in a blur, instantly at Airadin's side. Master, came a voice from within the folds of black, a black so deep it appeared to be moving shadow. I told you to be cautious with the old man. Chastise me later, Airadin growled weakly. Get me out of here. The figure nodded and reached out, grasping Airadin by the forearm. And then they too vanished.